We are less than 1 week away from the historic 2024 presidential election, a incredibly close contest that will decide the 47th president of the United States, either Republican Donald Trump or Democratic Vice President Kamala Harris will be inaugurated into the Oval Office in January 2025, and Georgia will be one of those very small handful of states that will decide the outcome of this year's presidential election. Thanks for joining us for this edition of Political Update. Here on Atlanta News First, I'm Tim Darnell, joined by one of our favorite people to talk politics with here at Atlanta News First, Dr. Benjamin Taylor, Professor of Political Science at Kennesaw State University. Dr. Taylor, Georgia has shattered virtually every previous early and advanced voting record on the books right now, and we are in the final few hours as of this taping of early and advanced voting. We wrapped up the only one of two optional weekend votings or at the polling places very recently. No more weekend voting and only a few hours left of early voting. You and I were talking before we began recording. You have some fascinating insights on the demographics that are really powering all of these record-shattering numbers behind early and advanced voting. Take us through a couple of these fascinating insights that we were talking about just a few minutes ago.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Tim. I really enjoy being here. But one of the things we've noticed is that the age demographic breakdown. So when we think about voting overall, usually voters between the ages of 18 and 29 are some of the least likely voters to vote. But what's fascinating is that age demographic is actually outpacing the 30 to 39-year-old demographic, which is something we wouldn't expect. So that demonstrates a bit that there is some real momentum, I think, among young voters to turn out to vote. Again, they aren't turning out at the same levels as the people we would most expect, which are basically middle-aged voters, people between the ages of 50 and 65. But in any event, young voters are really turning out at a very high clip, particularly the youngest demographic. And then also women continue to outpace men in voter turnout in Georgia based on Secretary of State data. But when it comes to racial and ethnic demographics, it looks pretty much like the state. African Americans are turning out at about a 25% clip. They're about 25% of the voting public, and white voters are about 59%, give or take, which is basically representative of the state overall. So in general, turnout is robust. And it's going to be very exciting to see how many people turn out on Election Day to see if we can get the largest turnout in Georgia history.
When we were talking about the turnout earlier before we began recording, and you find it fascinating that the 18 to 29 group and also perhaps even the 30 to 39 age groups are turning out more robustly than they have in the past in terms of early voting.
Right.
Does this lean more toward the Democrats' favor and Kamala Harris? Or, Donald Trump appeared on Joe Rogan's podcast very recently, the most listened to podcaster in the world, and that's a podcast that's aimed at that 18 to 29 graphic or demographic. Who does this actually benefit?
That's a great question, and I think that both campaigns have arguments that the turnout among 18 to 29-year-olds is working in their favor. As you point out, the Trump campaign has made a concerted effort, much more so than previous Republican presidential campaigns, to target the youngest, most unlikely voting demographic, which are these young voters. And they think that they can do that because they think they're breaking up some of the traditional ethnic boundaries in terms of how African Americans are voting for Democrats, but think that they can make inroads with young African American voters, particularly African American men. But the Harris campaign, if you look at poll data, which until Election Day, all we have is poll data to sort of estimate what the voting public might look like. Polling data suggests that Vice President Harris is the overwhelming favorite of voters in this age group. So if polling data is accurate, and if the Harris campaign is able to get the vote choice in Georgia to reflect basic sort of approval ratings in most public opinion polls, then having high turnout among this demographic is probably good news for them. On the other hand, if you're the Trump campaign and you think you're making inroads, particularly with minority men in this young age demographic who basically would not have voted in the past, but if you've gotten them to come out to vote, and they're going to vote for the Republican candidate, that's a very important change in American elections. So these are empirical questions that we can't answer until Election Day, but that's sort of what both campaigns would think about looking at this robust young demographic turnout.
From the standpoint of an electoral strategy, is it a gamble? Is it a gambit that the Trump campaign is playing, really hoping and praying that this one demographic that has historically been low propensity in terms of turnout at the polls, is it a gamble on his part that he is making such a hard sell to that 18 to 29 demographic?
Well, it might be, but it's going to be a very, very close election. If we remember 2020, fewer than 12,000 votes separated President Biden from at the time President Trump. So, similarly this year, it's going to be very, very close. So if you're looking to scrape by a few thousand votes here or there, doing these sort of high risk, high reward strategies like targeting young minority voters for the Trump campaign who historical patterns would suggest would not vote for a Republican candidate if they come out to vote, but the Trump campaign thinks they have a message that attracts them. Similarly, the Harris campaign is interestingly turning their strategy from historical norms of a Democratic candidate, whereas Democratic candidates would not have spent a lot of time trying to motivate voters in suburbs and college-educated voters who historically have been Republicans. Now you see the Harris campaign targeting that demographic specifically, particularly suburban women who historically have been Republicans. These people may have actually even voted for Brian Kemp in 2018 and 2022, but now that Harris campaign is targeting those voters. So you see sort of a real evolution of campaign strategy in Georgia as the demographics change and as Georgia voting patterns evolve over time as well.
Now, very recently, Vice President Harris held an Atlanta rally in DeKalb County where former President Barack Obama, arguably the most popular figure in the Democratic Party, and among many voters, he still has a number of supporters who have, endorsed his candidacy years ago and two very successful terms as president. She has really encouraged him and is incorporating his comments to really raise her profile among the younger African American male voters. Why do you think, and does she even have a gap in that demographic support? And if so, does using Barack Obama help her close that gap?
Potentially, using former President Obama as a spokesperson is always a good idea. Anytime you get a former president of your party to come out and endorse you, well, we would expect such a thing. But secondly, it's very important because it gets a lot of media attention. And one of the things about these rallies that's important to realize is that the rally itself is there to generate media attention so that these what we call low propensity voters who don't really engage much in politics or think much about it. They're going to see it on the news. They're going to see it in their social media feed, and that'll sort of give them a cue. Oh, yeah, something important is going on. But moreover, President Obama is extremely popular with the Democratic base, and these rallies in Georgia and other swing states are designed to sort of get local media attention, but also be, fundamentally pep rallies for the base. And so the base activists go to these rallies, they get to see a former president, they get to see stars like Bruce Springsteen or whomever, and then they get really energized, and then they go home and they tell their friends and their family, who may be some of these low propensity voters, and that's sort of the cascading social network effect of these rallies, and that's really what you see going on. Whether or not it will help her specifically with any one demographic or not is really an empirical question that we have to wait for Election Day to know, but I do think that that's kind of the idea that the Harris campaign is running with, and the Trump campaign as well, with some of their speakers, as you pointed out, going on podcasts like Joe Rogan, getting the mere fact that there's a presidential campaign, hard though it is to believe that there are people who don't know what's happening. That's true. There are people who are sort of not plugged into politics, and going to these sort of using big name folks in rallies, but also going to these sort of unlikely places like podcasts are really good ways to get the information to these low information voters that the campaigns need them to have to at least motivate them to come out to vote, and then of course vote for their candidacy, whomever they are.
And speaking of going to places that are a little out of the way, Donald Trump and J.D. Vance held a rally before last week's rally in Duluth at a small church in Zebulon, Georgia, in Pike County. What was the rationale for holding an event at a church in a small community, kind of halfway between here and Macon, sort of to the southwest, and then heading north to the Gas South Arena for a very sold-out Duluth rally? What was the rationale behind that?
Well, the idea there, I think, is that the Trump campaign knows that they need to generate big turnout amongst what we would think of as Republican-based voters. So that's why you go to Zebulon, which is not really an area that would be very competitive in the presidential race. And it's a very strongly conservative area. And so, but you want to generate a lot of turnout there. You want to get the margins in the strongholds as large as you possibly can, so that when the vote count comes in from the Metro Atlanta area, Metro Columbus, Metro Augusta, Macon, Savannah, that you have a cushion, as it were, so that the larger, more populated counties, which are much more heavily Democratic, when they start turning it, if you've got big margins in rural areas and more conservative strongholds, then you can sort of hold on to the lead, as it were, on election night. But so that's one of the reasons you go to Zebulon if you're former President Trump. But then you saw him go to Gas South Arena because, again, the North Atlanta suburbs for decades and decades were very, very, very comfortable places for Republicans, and that has been less the case in recent years, particularly in national and federal level elections. And so I think you see the Trump campaign trying to blunt some of the Harris sort of margins there, right? They're trying to remind these voters, oh, yes, you are Republicans, and we have a message that you might want to hear, and so that's why they go there. But again, the rallies are for the activists. They get excited and motivated, and then they go out and tell their friends and family about it and do some activism themselves and maybe volunteer for the campaign. And that's sort of the dual strategies that the Trump campaign is running in and around Georgia.
Second gentleman, Douglas Emhoff, was in Atlanta over this past weekend, or in Georgia, I should say. Also, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, who is Kamala Harris's vice presidential running mate, has been in Savannah and Columbus for an early vote get-out. Donald Trump this past weekend held a sold-out rally at Madison Square Garden, and he has also held another Atlanta rally at Georgia Tech earlier this week. Why, if Donald Trump coming to downtown Atlanta, Georgia Tech, Atlanta, majority African American, majority Democrat city, what's the strategy behind his rally at Georgia Tech only a couple of days ago?
I think it's really about media attention, and it's about, generating earned media content, right? You want to get eyeballs on the candidate. You want to remind people that he was here. The Atlanta News First is going to be there covering the event. Was there covering the event, and so you get the fact of the matter is you get the campaign in front of people on who might not otherwise be involved, and also it's a big space. You need them. Some of it's just logistical, right? I mean, you need the physical space. You need the capacity. Proximity to the airport, so on and so forth. But the bottom line is that these events, the Emhoff event, Walz, Trump, no matter who is the sort of presenting the message, the idea is that you motivate your base voters, you get them engaged, you get them excited, you remind people to vote. One of the things that happened at Trump rallies, which did not happen in 2020 or 2016 for that matter, is that they are strongly encouraging early voting, taking people to vote. Like, tell your friends, tell your family, go together, right? You all live in the same neighborhood. Join up in the minivan and let's go vote. That kind of thing. And so I think that's one of the main reasons you have these rallies, to just sort of emphasize over and over and over again what's at stake for your candidacy, but then also that you want people to vote, that there are multiple ways to vote. And the bottom line is that what we know from advertising, sort of 101, is that repetition is key, and there is no better repetitive source than the candidate themselves telling people over and over and over again to go vote, take your friends and family. And so that's what these rallies are doing in all of these swing states. It's going to be so close in so many of these states that it's something of an old saw, but it's true. Every vote does count, and you need as many of these voters out there as you can if you're the candidate.
One of the other battleground states besides Georgia, will be crucial to election night, November 5th, the results, whatever they may be. One of the other battleground states that you are watching?
Well, the big battlegrounds in the 2024 election are Arizona, Nevada. Then you have the so-called blue wall states of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And then you've got sort of the new South, as it were, of Georgia and North Carolina. Those are the big swing states in this election. Although there's always the chance that a state that we weren't expecting could pop up and be important. I know that recent poll data from the New York Times shows that Kamala Harris has a fairly sizable lead in the Nebraska 2nd District, and so she might win that electoral college vote. And then, of course, there's a tight Senate race out there as well. Is it enough to shift the state of Nebraska into competitive territory? Probably not, but it's something to keep an eye on. There's always stuff like that out there. But those aforementioned states are the ones to keep an eye on, and the results are going to come in as the time zones change. And so Georgia and North Carolina are probably going to be a couple of the first states to release results, although North Carolina does close voting a little later than Georgia does. But in any event, those are the states I'm watching.
In terms of time zones, as we wrap up this edition of Political Update here on Atlanta News First with Dr. Ben Taylor, Professor of Political Science at Kennesaw State University, will we see a certified, I'll rephrase that, not a certified winner, will we see a projected winner to become the 47th president of the United States before midnight, Tuesday, November 5th?
That seems unlikely, but possible, but I would say unlikely, just because of the vagaries of the way states count ballots. Pennsylvania and Wisconsin specifically have varying rules about how you count ballots and when you can start counting ballots. And so really it's just it's an administrative problem is what it is. There's nothing nefarious happening, but it's just that states have different rules about when and how you can count ballots, what types of ballots can be counted, and the effect of that is that it just slows the process down. Although I will say that Secretary of State Raffensperger, for Georgia's part, has said numerous times that Georgia will be counted, tabulated, and we will know who won Georgia. He hopes by, I've heard him say midnight, so relatively speaking, that would be great. Personally, I'd be really excited about that.
As would a lot of people in the newsroom, I know. Thanks to Dr. Ben Taylor, Professor of Political Science at Kennesaw State University, for joining us on this edition of Political Update. We have our podcast airing every Wednesday at 1:30 p.m. on YouTube. You can watch all of our podcasts on the Atlanta News First YouTube channel and listen to all of the Atlanta News First podcasts wherever you download your podcast, whether or not it be on Apple, Amazon, Spotify, or your favorite podcasting platform. Thanks for watching and listening to this edition of Political Update on Atlanta News First as Georgia continues its role as the premier battleground state in election 2024.